Well, welcome to this pitching research masterclass. This is module 2, the basic primer of pitching research. So we have 3 goals for today's module. The first goal is to give you a basic feel for how the pitching research template works and some of the underlying basic philosophy. We'll then provide you a simple example and we'll finish with some helpful resources. So goal number 1. So what's the pitch template all about? How does it work? What's the underlying philosophy? The way I like to set this out is in terms of this cartoon. It's just a 3-cell cartoon. It's taken from phdcomics.com. And in this cartoon, we have 2 characters. We have the grumpy professor, the bearded professor with the lovely green vest and red tie. So I like to relate to that character in this cartoon. And we have as a second character, a PhD student. So what has basically happened is the student's been working very hard. You could imagine over 2 weeks, over 4 weeks, or maybe longer. And the student has created a set of material. And in this case, it's reflected or represented by a bunch of papers. So a bunch of sheets of paper. And the professor and the student are about to have a meeting. And the student asks in the first cell, "Sir, did you read the draft I left on your desk?" The professor says, "I've looked at it." Now, cell 2 and cell 3 give us 2 very different scenarios of what "I've looked at it" means. The middle cell tells us what the student is desperately hoping. And what the student desperately hopes is that the professor has taken a lot of time to read every page, to read every paragraph, to dwell on every sentence and every word. And we can see there are many, many pages there. This would take a long time. You can imagine the professor would need to spend several or many hours doing this. Cell 3 reflects what it probably means. I've looked at it. And the professor has just tilted his head to the right, and from a distance, he eyes or sights a big pile of paper. Now, if that latter cell is closer to the truth, then we're going to have a meeting that is very unsatisfactory. The student will walk away shaking their head saying, "The professor never reads my work." The professor will be shaking his head saying, why does the student give me so much? I'm drowning in words, in paragraphs, in pages. I don't have the time. So there's a problem here. And I guess there's a related set of problems. I'm going to focus on one in particular, although the main problem here is time. Time is the enemy, and the student has made a strategic flaw in giving too much information when a lot less information would be so much more beneficial. So what is the problem apart from time being the enemy? Well, the first part of the problem is it's around communication. The student is not availing themselves of a strategy that will achieve a positive communication outcome. What's the second problem? Well, it's communication, and indeed, it's all about communication, at least for the purpose of today's webinar. We need to be able to communicate, and it's a challenging setting for communication in this case, because as pitching research is all about for today's webinar, you're trying to communicate to an academic expert in the field. And this is a difficult task, but I'm going to try and convince you that the pitching research tool and framework makes this difficult task easier. When you have access to these PowerPoints, you will be able to action the link on this slide. I would highly recommend that you do this. It's a 9-minute primer animation video that essentially takes you through the framework of pitching research. From that video, you would glean that the framework is as reflected on this slide. And it's a very simple tool. If you look down the left-hand column, there are indeed 11 items which you need to populate with some words. Okay, let's have a look at what these items are and read them off. So we have item A, the working title. We have item B, the basic research question. Item C are the key papers. Item D, motivation/puzzle. We have item E, which is the idea. We have item F, which is the data. We have item G, which is the tools. The next two items are what's new and so what. These are items H and I, respectively. The penultimate item is item J, contribution. And then we have a final item, item K, other considerations. To give you a better feel for how these different elements fit together, please refer to this slide. And there's quite a few things happening in this slide. If you look down the left-hand side, I'm labeling the items into two groups. The first four items, items A through D, I'm suggesting to you are about asking the question. And the question here is the research question. The remaining items are about finding an answer to that question. So we have two groups. The first four, asking the question. The remaining seven, finding an answer. Keep that in your mind as we now look at what is further revealed in this slide. The suggestion with regard to the three pink headings are three segments of this framework. The first segment is what I've described as the big picture anchoring or framing. The second segment is about, and is the core of the framework, the project specifics. And then the final item is essentially asking us, is there anything else? So let's go back, circle back to the big picture anchoring. And this involves the first four items, items A, B, C, and D. Now, highlighted in yellow is further information that's trying to help you understand what each of these items are and how they relate to each other. So items A and B are two items around what. Okay, item A, what is the project about? And that is the working title. And you can think of that as being a less technical piece as a starting point. Item B is another what question. What is the research question? And this can be more technical and most likely will be more technical than what you've said for the working title. So two what questions to start. Items C and D are now why questions. And indeed, they have a very common theme. They are questions that ask, why this question? Why have you chosen to look at this research question? So item C takes a narrow view of this. Why this question in terms of the key papers? Item D takes a broader perspective of why this research question in terms of the motivation. And as I've said, as a package, these first four items are a big picture, hover over the broad area of research, and in a collective or holistic way, they are about asking the question. So let's move to the latter items of the framework, the project specifics, items E through J. So let's look at the first three of these project specific items, E, F, and G. And these are the building blocks of the pitching research framework. So we have in this set of 3, a what question and 2 how questions. So item E, what is the key intellectual idea of the project? F and G are 2 how questions. And in fact, they have a very common basis. They are asking, how will you execute it? That is the project, the research project. How will you execute it in terms of, for item F, the data? And item G, how will you execute the project in terms of tools? Okay, this package of 3 are the basic building blocks of the project specifics around your research. Let's look at items H, I, and J. And these are all why questions. In fact, they've got a very common theme to them. They're all asking, why this project? Let's look at item H. Why this project in terms of what is new about this project? Item I, why this project? Why is it important? In other words, so what? And item J is again asking, why this project? But now it's in terms of how does it progress knowledge in the narrow, but also, and probably more importantly, in the broad, from the perspective of the broader view of the literature. In other words, why this project in terms of its contribution. Item K is a catch-all, and it's picking up any other considerations that are worth highlighting for your proposed project. So let's think about the items a little further. This slide reminds us and reinforces what I said earlier, that the first 4 items are framing the big picture, and they've got 2 basic elements. They're asking what and why at this big picture level. So let me give you a few quick pieces of advice on how you would attack each of these items. For the working title, make it informative, make it simple, make it short. For the research question, often I think a neutral statement is quite helpful here. It's the notion that defines the scope of the analysis, or if you like, the terms of reference, and it can be a little more technical than the working title. The key papers, strong word of advice here, choose 3 key papers, the 3 salient or most influential papers that you've read that you think best positions your work. And these papers should be as recent as you can make them. They should be written by leaders in the field, the so-called gurus. And if at all possible, you should choose them from the highest quality journals in your area, so the tier 1 journals. In terms of motivation puzzle, item D, think of this from the demand side. So what I mean here is, think of there being a latent demand from your colleagues in this area of research, and that your research community is in some way has a demand for a big new piece of knowledge. So what you're trying to do with this part is identify that from a big picture level, that big piece of knowledge that is currently missing. Now let's look at the next 3 items. These are the project-specific building blocks, the basic building blocks. They're asking what, but mostly how. So let me give you some quick pieces of advice on each of these building blocks. The idea, item E. So what specifically will you do? How do we go about getting an answer to the question? And for quantitative studies, this can often be expressed in terms of either predictions or hypotheses. And you can think of this as a little bit like the recipe if we wanted to use the metaphor of making something in the kitchen. What about the data? Well, as I've already said, this is about the how, the basic ingredients in which you will bring life to your empirical research. The tools, another angle on how, and you can think of this in terms of the kitchen metaphor as the essential aids and utensils that you need in order to mix together the data and shed some light, some credible light, some reliable light on the idea, and give some evidence that will help us understand whether the hypothesis or the prediction is supported or it's not supported. The next two items of the project specifics are the two key questions. And these, as I've already said, are drilling down to why. Some quick words of advice on these two questions. So item H, what's new? Think of this as from the supply side. So you are a researcher, you belong to a research community, and researchers like you are trying to supply some new knowledge to that community. So you're on the supply side. So the what's new is about making a statement around the new knowledge, and it's going to be a smaller piece relative to the demand side that you identified earlier. So what smaller piece of new knowledge can you hopefully create to broadly help meet the demand that you identified earlier in the template? Item I, the so what. Essentially, it's about expressing why this research is important. Why is it important to know the answer to the question that you've set? Now, one way of metaphorically representing the what's new question is around what I call the Mickey Mouse diagram. So what's new, Mickey Mouse? The reference here to Mickey Mouse is a silhouette of the Venn diagram, the three-circle Venn diagram. So we have two ears and one head for Mickey. So aspect 1 and aspect 2 are the ears, and Mickey's head is aspect 3. And I've been very general here. I've used the terminology aspect because I don't want to give any leading information as to what might go into each label for this diagram. The assessment needs to be made by the user, and the assessment is driven by what you feel are the most salient elements of your research, that when you put them together, the intersection of those three circles will define the sweet spot of your research and the novelty that you are trying to achieve. So item J is the contribution. It's like the one bottom line of it all. If you were asked to express the overriding theme of your research and how it's going to create new knowledge, what is that theme? So quick word of advice on this. Think of it as going beyond what's new. Think of it going beyond so what. And this is why I said earlier, take a broader perspective here, because the what's new and so what are really a narrow perspective about your specific project. But in the contribution part, you're trying to take up a much more challenging question of, in a broader sense, what new doors, what pathway is being opened to new knowledge generally? And the strongest position we can be in is where that pathway is part of a research program. Item K is the other considerations, and the SSRN paper that I'll refer to very shortly gives you some guidance on these other considerations. When you get access to these PowerPoints, I would strongly recommend that you have a look at this student example. the student, Jess Yan, used my simple show in 3 parts. So there's a 2-minute, a 3-minute, and a 2-minute part that, when put together, illustrates not only the general use of the pitching research framework, but shows as an example Jess's research that she was working on at the time. It's a very, very nice example. So we're getting close to rounding out goal 1. And what I'd like to share with you now is some guidance on how you would go about doing that. Well, first of all, there's an overall budget of words. If you think back to that cartoon strip that we started off, the problem, or one of the problems, was too many words, too many pages. The professor would not be inclined to read that in any detail. So I've plumbed with an overall budget of 1,000 words. And if you like, you can have a 20% plus or minus on that. So 800 words at a minimum, 1,200 words at a maximum. I think if you go outside those bounds, you start to hit problems. There are 5 golden rules that I'd recommend for you in terms of how you go about, in a sense, choosing those 1,000 words. So your chosen 1,000 words should be clear, focused, and to the point. Your chosen 1,000 words should be meaningful. Your chosen 1,000 words should reflect effort. Your chosen 1,000 words should be connected internally. And the 5th golden rule is that your chosen 1,000 words should start a conversation, i.e., it's communication. That is what you're trying to do with this effort. You should not strive for perfection, because what you will find is, in a sense, perfection is unattainable, because things will be changing all the time. And you will overinvest on perfection when a really successful outcome will be you have a fantastic conversation, either in person, via Zoom, via email. You have a fantastic conversation with your mentor or your research collaborator. Now, one thing that might be crossing your mind at this stage is you're a little confused about these terms. You find them that they overlap, and maybe you have a feeling that they're very similar and that you can't distinguish between several of them. So in the next couple of slides, I want to give you some general guidance on how you should overcome this particular concern. So how can we distinguish between the different elements of the pitching research template? Consider these 5 things. First of all, there's a communication budget in terms of the number of words per item, and I'm going to share that with you in the next slide. The second consideration is asking the question or finding the answer. The third consideration is to think about whether it's to do with the big picture or whether it's to do with project specifics. The fourth consideration will be whether it's an item that is asking a what question. Is it asking a why question? Is it asking a how question? And the 5th consideration is, do you take a narrow perspective or do you take a broader perspective? Now, in combination, if you take a positive view to each of those 5 considerations, you should be able to delineate the difference in a meaningful way between the elements of the pitching research template. And let me summarize that for you in this table. I won't go through in detail the elements in this table. I'll talk about the communication budget because we haven't looked at that in terms of the elements. And I'll also talk a little bit about the final column, narrow versus broad. But the 3 columns in the middle are just summarizing what we've already covered in previous slides to this module. So I won't go over those in detail. But what I'd suggest to you later offline is to look at how the combination of the 5 columns and the 5 considerations should allow you to distinguish between any 2 or more items that you're getting confused about as to how they are different from each other. So I leave that exercise for you offline later. Let me make some comments about the communication budget. So the second column in red, and then I'll make some comments about narrow versus broad. The communication budget. Now these are indicative. So against the working title, I suggest 10 to 12 words. I think if you have less than 10 words, it starts to become too brief. And more than 12 words, you start to lose your reader. You start to lose your audience. The research question. You have a little bit more room to move here. 20 to 30 words, 1 or 2 sentences. So it can elaborate in a sense on the working title. But as I said earlier, it can be and probably should be more technical. What about the key papers? Well, you need to choose 3 papers, and I'm thinking that will take 60 to 70 words, indicative. Motivation and puzzle. This is where I probably give you the biggest word budget, somewhere around 150 to 200 words. And if you like writing in sentences, that's about 4 to 6 sentences. If you like dot points, 4 to 6 dot points. Now, idea, data, and tools all get the same budget each. 1 to 150 words each. If you like writing, and probably dot points, I'm happy with here, 3 to 6 dot points for each of those. 100 to 150 words for items E, F, and G, idea, data, and tools. What about the word budget for what's new, so what, and contribution? Slightly shorter and all the same. So for each of those, 50 to 100 words, 2 to 4 sentences for what's new, so what, and contribution. And then with other considerations, again, 50 to 100 words, I'm happy to have those in dot points, 3 dot points. Now, if you add up those words in terms of the minimum, it gets somewhere in the vicinity of 800. The maximum is somewhere in the vicinity of 1200. They're indicative, but I think in my mind, and having seen a lot of examples, there is a nice balance there in terms of the word budget and how you should go about using this framework. Whether the item is asking the question or finding the answer, we talked about that earlier. I've summarized it in the 3rd column in this table. Big picture versus project specific. I've summarized that in the 4th column. We talked about that earlier. Whether it's a what, why, or how question is the penultimate column in the table, and we talked about that earlier. The final column I just want to briefly elaborate on because we haven't talked about it, at least not explicitly. And I think this one will help to give you an additional dimension to make the distinction between items that you might be confused as being very similar. Do you attack it in the narrow or in the broad in terms of the focus? Well, in terms of the working title, to me, it should be in a narrow. It should be in the narrow because you're trying to signal not only to yourself initially, but to the audience, to your mentor, to your supervisor, what your research is about. So if it's too broad, you'll lose them. So it should be narrow. And as I said earlier, less technical. The research question, however, can be broad. And think of it this way, that the research question you're choosing is one that is very likely common to a range of other researchers that have already done research in this field or are currently doing research in this field or in the future will do research in this field. So the research question I would suggest to you can be broader and more technical. The key papers are a narrow focus, whereas the motivation is a broader focus around setting the scene for your research. So you have to choose 3 key papers from a collection of 100 or more. That's narrowing down. The motivation slash puzzle part is where you can broaden out the perspective that you're trying to bring, this bigger picture perspective, this framing of your research. Now, idea, data, tools, what's new, so what, I've suggested all have a narrow focus because this is all about your project specific angle. I'm suggesting with contribution, take a broader focus because now you're trying to convince a reader that your work will have a broader impact on the academy than what is just narrowly viewed as the project itself or the paper itself when it's eventually done. Other considerations can be a blend of narrow and broad. So a couple of examples to round out goal one, and then we'll move on to look at an example of using the pitching research template. So what if you're confused about data versus tools? And you might think, oh, that's a bit of a strange one. Most people would have a pretty clear delineation between data and tools. But I've seen in various cases, there is some confusion, and it might often link to where one is doing qualitative research and where maybe you're doing, you're collecting primary data. So a couple of comments here just to help this delineation. The base raw secondary data should be independent of the tools. So if you're using secondary data, you're getting that from, let's say, a commercial database, it's the data. The data are the data. Now, sometimes tools help create primary data, and this is where you can get into a little bit of confusion because when you talk about data and you talk about tools, there's some similarity and overlap. And that's okay and that's natural, but try and do it in a way that it's not totally repetitive and that when you truly are talking about the data, the ingredients, focus on that part versus the tools that you use that may help you to manipulate the data as well as analyze and test the data. Now, often the specific nature of the data requires certain gold standard tools, and you should be aware of that with your research. The second example that I've got on the slide is some confusion or potential confusion between what's new versus so what. And I've got two simple pieces of advice here, which hopefully will make it very clear my views. So first piece of advice, just because it's new doesn't make it important. Okay, so if you clearly make a statement about novelty, don't fall for the temptation. I'm just going to repeat that in terms of so what. It doesn't make it important just by saying it's new. Second one is the flip side of that. Just because it's important doesn't make it new. Okay. Well, let me just give you a scenario characterization of pitches. There's a 2x2 matrix at the bottom of this slide, and the horizontal perspective is whether it's an ex ante versus an ex post application. The vertical perspective is it a real application or a hypothetical application? Now, many of you will be tracking towards the intersection of ex ante and real. In other words, a personal pitch of your research as a master's research student, as your research as a PhD research student, as your research as an early career researcher, or if you are a more experienced researcher, a personal pitch of your research plan, ex ante intersecting with real applications. There are other applications, however, that can be used as a stepping stone to this ultimate personal pitch. The intersection of ex post with real would give you a reverse engineered pitch. And there's a module in this series that looks at the reverse engineered challenge. If ex ante is intersected with hypothetical, then you can have a fantasy pitching situation. And there's a module that will follow that takes you through the fantasy pitching exercise. And a further stepping stone to creating your personal pitch would be the intersection of an ex post application and a hypothetical application. And this is what I call pitch sparring. And again, there will be a module that looks at the pitch sparring application. Now, for a more detailed explanation of the pitching research framework, I couldn't recommend too strongly that you go to the SSRN and download pitching research. It's freely available from the Social Sciences Research Network. It's easy to find. When you get the PowerPoint slide, you can execute the link that's shown on this slide, and it will give you all the detail and be a personal record that you can refer to as and when you need it once you've downloaded it. Well, that's the end of goal 1. Goal 2 and goal 3 won't take as much time, and we'll transition straight to goal 2 now. So goal 2 is to give you a simple pitch example. And this is an example I created quite a number of years ago, around about 2013, 2014. And essentially, it's an example that pitches the pitch. It pitches the pitching framework. And on the slide, I just show you it in its entirety. This is not good for presentation mode, and I've got these elements on individual slides following. But I just wanted to show you the holistic view of the pitch. There's probably no more than about 600 or 700 words here. So I've actually broken the rule of the minimum number of words, but it can still work with so few words. So let's have a look at pitching the pitch. Well, the working title here is a scholarly pitching research tool. The basic research question is to create a tool or to create a mindset that captures the essential information needed to give a sound basis for starting a new scholarly research project. Item C, the 3 key papers. Now, the 3 key papers, bearing in mind this pitch was created around about 2013, 2014. These 3 key papers were very new at the time. It's a paper by Don Stokes in 2013 titled Generating Innovative Research Ideas. Now, this title is very indicative of what the paper's about. Essentially, Don goes through, based on his experience of over 30 years as a successful accounting/auditing researcher, all of the things that he had found through his work could help generate an innovative research idea. And he outlines a number of strategies, and it's a paper very well worth your time to have a look at, published in the Journal of Accounting Management Information Systems. The second paper is a paper by Peter Clarkson at the University of Queensland, publishing Art or Science, Reflections from an Editorial Perspective, published in Accounting and Finance. Now, what Pete does in this paper is bring together his distillation of a whole bunch of themes that he had picked up at the time around being an editor of a fairly prominent journal. And in fact, it wasn't just Accounting and Finance that he was involved in, but several other journals, including Contemporary Accounting Research. So again, giving a lot of insights and reflections about the publication game, but it's not just about publishing. It actually gives us a lot of insight in terms of how to do good research, because ultimately we do want to get published. And so if we do good research, we hopefully will get published. The third paper is a paper of mine published in Accounting and Finance. And it's got quite a weird title, Mickey Mouse and the Idiot Principle for assessing research contribution. And the reason I've included this one was it was the first time that I'd identified explicitly the 3 building blocks as our framework for looking at research. So the IDIOT acronym has capitalized the letters I for idea, D for data, and T for tools. So in terms of item D for this pitch, the motivation and puzzle. So what I say here is that the hardest thing about doing research and doing good research is starting it. Now, finishing is also difficult, but as I say here, if you don't begin or don't begin well, then finishing is irrelevant. It's basically academic. And novice researchers really have a tough time knowing how to start research and to start it in a very fruitful and productive way. And what they're trying to do is to convince a research mentor that they do have good ideas and that the mentor will endorse and support and collaborate with them on the research. Now, as we saw earlier in the cartoon strip, the mentor is busy and sometimes grumpy. So the most effective way of pitching your research has to be thought through carefully. And so that's why we want to create a tool, a mindset that starts that conversation. So what about the basic building blocks for pitching the pitch? So the idea, the data, and the tools. Well, in terms of the idea, it's all about the pitch. It's about the relationship between 2 key parties to the pitch, and they're central and critical. And those 2 key parties are the pitcher, which is typically the student, and the pitchee, which is typically the mentor or the supervisor. So the core idea here really does hinge on the template, on the framework that needs to be developed that will help this relationship, will help the communication between the pitcher and the pitchee. So what are the data here? Well, the data are a little different from normal. So this isn't a typical quantitative study, for example, where the data would be a lot of quantitative numbers. The nature of the data here you can think of as the worked examples of the template showing the novice researchers in a very real and practical way the proof of concept, how it can work in their field of interest. What about the tools? Well, the core tool here is the naked pitch template itself, the vanilla template, which is supplemented by a range of things, including advice on its use, the version of the template with cues, so there are prompts for the user of the template and how they can go about populating the template for their example. An evolving library of examples can also be thought of as part of the tools. An expanding set of internet resources, videos, appendices, PowerPoint slides, and even a web-based application and portal. These ultimately turn out to be part of the tool set. So what's new? Well, the novelty here is linked to the challenge faced by novice researchers of creating or initiating that conversation, the conversation with a mentor in a simple and clear way. The second angle on the novelty here is the simple template device. Now, it's not new in its components, but it's new in terms of how they are brought together, the overall design, the package, the full holistic advice, etc. This is the novelty of this approach. So what? Well, it's important because there'll be major efficiencies. At least this is the argument. And as shown in item I here, think of it in terms of the savings in time at the beginning of the research journey. Savings in time both for the novice as well as the seasoned researchers. And this can then have spillover effects in terms of building your confidence, psychological and motivational benefits that get you moving much faster than you would have if you didn't have that tool. So in terms of what's new, Mickey Mouse, it's the intersection of starting a new research project, novice researchers, and research mentoring. And so the sweet spot of these three is really capturing the novelty. So the contribution is around the free provision of a simple tool and deep support across the full spectrum of academic research with many potential applications, not only in my home discipline of finance and my secondary discipline of accounting, but in all other disciplines, management, CSR, chemistry, physics, healthcare, psychology. It's not discipline constrained. So there's a bunch of other considerations there, which in the interest of time, I'll let you look at offline, but I talk about target journal, I talk about collaboration, I talk about a risk assessment of competitors. Is there a competitor risk, a risk of obsolescence, or is there a risk of no result? Now, the core publication outcome of that exercise was a publication in 2015 in the journal Accounting and Finance, and the title of the paper was A Simple Template for Pitching Research, and it's the publication foundation stone of the pitching research framework. Very quickly, goal 3, other pitching resources. I'll let you dwell on these offline, but one to give a very strong recommendation is the one-stop shop for all things pitching. It's pitchingresearch.com. So I'd recommend you give that a look out. It has, it hosts a huge array of resources, and these are classified and categorized in terms of the modules that will be built up over time for the pitching research framework. There's also another SSRN paper, Pitching Research Resource Center, and the link for that is shown in this slide. When you get these slides, you'll be able to go to that research paper on SSRN, but it's fairly easy to find as well. The research types that we have both on the pitchingresearch.com website and in that SSRN paper are references to other SSRN papers. There's alternative templates, designs and applications. There's an online library of worked examples. There's a web portal, pitchmyresearch.com. There's PowerPoint decks, and there's YouTube videos. So just as an example, the link here shows a link to the online library. You've got a screenshot of the opening of that online library. It's organized alphabetically, and so you would be able to make out there. It's a bit hard to read. Under A, there are accounting, auditing examples. There's an aviation example. So with that, I hope that you found this module very informative, and I wish you well in learning more about pitching research and developing your own research pitch that will help you create a conversation, to start a conversation with those who you wish to collaborate with in the future. Thank you very much.